Hi, it's Dwyer. It is May 14th, 2025. Dwyercrime.blog, also always 1776.com. Let's talk about Diddy's girlfriend, Cassie's first day of testimony. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, it's very important at all times when we're talking about a trial to understand that in the United States, we are in a free country, right? That's very important. Adults get to make their own decision. These trials shouldn't be a morality play where jurors are asked, hey, do you agree with this lifestyle? If the lifestyle being discussed is legal, right? You can say, hey, I don't believe in sex at all, right? You have those people. Or, I'm with my high school girlfriend and I've never had sex with anyone else. Right? Whatever your personal story, your question as a juror is, did this man break the law? Right? Has the case been properly charged? Right? They say he ran a red light. And then the evidence is that the light was red and he ran it. Or is this overcharged, where they wanted a plea deal, the they being the prosecution? Let's be clear. You know how law enforcement works. They want a plea deal. They say, look, we could convict you under the statute for sex trafficking. You're looking at X years in prison. Talk to us if you want a plea deal. We'll drop some charges. We'll replace them with some other charges, right? By analogy, we won't give you the death penalty. We'll give you life in prison if you admit to the murder. Right now, folks, I understand this is unpopular. That's why this video, for me personally, is important. This is an unpopular position right now. But it's clear to me from the star witness, Cassie's first day of testimony, that this case was hopelessly overcharged. Right? Don't get me wrong. Diddy is guilty of domestic violence in my eyes. Right? This really, at this point, unless there's other testimony, this case looks like a domestic violence case. Right? That's what it looks like to me. Diddy physically used force on Cassie. Right? The most important part of Cassie's testimony, as I see it, is when she confirms that the person in the hallway was her. Her argument is that she tried to leave. Right? She tried to leave a freak off. Diddy then, confronts her in the hallway. What happened, we can see on film. It happened without her consent. Okay, that's terrible. I'm not here to diminish that wrongdoing in any way, shape, or form. But what I want people to do is to think about someone who President Trump pardoned. Right? Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion in world history, right? In boxing. Jack Johnson had girlfriends, right? Some of the girlfriends were alleged to have been prostitutes. He would travel with these romantic partners and they would cross state lines. And of course, they then accused Johnson of violating white slavery statutes. I'm not kidding. Right? He was convicted of the Mann Act. Understand, there was a time in America, and it's a recent time, where former GOP presidential candidate John McCain and former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid both went to then President Barack Obama and said, we would support a pardon of Jack Johnson, because they understood, major Republican, major Democrat, they understood that Johnson traveling across state lines in this manner was not a crime. They understood that Johnson being with, a woman of a different race who he's romantically involved with was not involved in white slavery. So understand, Barack Obama didn't make the move to pardon Jack Johnson. I'm grateful personally that President Trump did, later administration, right? Because we can't have a misuse of statutes like this. Now, you have Diddy's girlfriend, and they're trying to tell you about sex trafficking. As I've said before, right, my view of sex trafficking is, forcing people into prostitution and then, traveling them across state lines, right, or into the country. That's what I think of as sex trafficking. I don't think of sex trafficking as, I'm in New York City, I hire a prostitute who lives in New Jersey, she crosses the bridge, comes into Manhattan, we have sex. I don't believe that's sex trafficking. I don't believe the public views that as sex trafficking. Now let's talk about Cassie's testimony, and let's just highlight some parts of it. And I know defending Diddy in any way, shape, or form right now is taboo because he's persona non grata. Right? No doubt there are many people who regret what they did at a Diddy freak-off. Right? No doubt there are, people who have second thoughts about what happened at a freak-off. Right? I'll agree, no one should be blackmailed by what they did voluntarily at a freak-off. Right? We haven't hit the part of the trial yet where anyone has taken the stand and has said they have been blackmailed. At this point, the focus is on the video in the hotel where Diddy is physical with Cassie. Right? I'll concede, if you believe that video, if you believe Cassie's testimony, she's a victim of domestic violence. I'm not here to excuse that behavior. But let's talk about the facts here, right? Because I am very concerned about the idea that Diddy and his girlfriend were engaged in what we used to call alternative lifestyle. Right? They're into swingers. Their sex life involves private pornography. Right? They're taking videos of sex acts with strangers. Right, folks? To me, that can all be done in a consensual setting. Let me go one step further. The prosecution has a high burden. It's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This is a criminal case. It's not a civil case. Right? It's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So if I'm in the jury box and I'm thinking, well, These two had an alternative lifestyle. I'm asking myself the question, was this consensual? Now, let's say some hard things here, right? Someone can have regrets later. That doesn't mean at the time they participated in certain things, they did so without consent. Right? So let's talk about Cassie's testimony. She meets Diddy in 2006. She's 19 years old. Now let's pause here. Right? Folks, 19 makes her legally an adult. In the United States, you can vote for president at 18, can't you? Right? Wasn't the average age of the combat soldier in Vietnam 19 years old? You can die for your country at 19. She's 19 years old. Now, on the one hand, you could say, oh, wow, she was young. On the other hand, we're in a legal courtroom. She's legally an adult. What does that mean? That means she can make her own decisions. Now, it's my understanding that later in this trial, they're going to try to show that underage people were involved in what was going on. Let's be clear here. Cassie is not underage. She's a grown woman legally. She can make her own decisions. Right? We don't want a world, at least I don't think we do, where we're going to try to jump between a grown woman and whoever she wants to sleep with, as long as they're an adult. Right? And as long as they consent. Let's go further, and some of these facts are very important. Understand that Cassie was a recording artist, and she signed up with Sean Combs's Bad Boy Records. Right, now let me just say, when you hire a manager, when you sign up with the record label, you're expecting them to have some control over your career. Aren't you? Wouldn't the record deal have you making certain promises that you're not going to record for a rival record company, and you're committing to be an artist for this record company for some period of time, and in return, the record company is going to shepherd your career, aren't they? Right? Isn't a manager in the business going to scrutinize your contracts? Isn't the manager going to be involved in your finances? They're negotiating on your behalf. Right? If I'm a advertiser and I want the artist to be involved in an ad campaign, am I not going to talk with her manager, her label? Are we not going to discuss finances? Hasn't the artist delegated those responsibilities to her manager, to her record label? Right? Aren't they part of the process consensually? Isn't this what you would expect if you were an artist and you signed up with a manager? Let's say I sign up with one of the biggest managers or players in the industry, in this case Diddy's label, right? Wouldn't I expect Diddy to then be negotiating on my behalf, to be paying me whatever is negotiated, to have whatever control is in the contract? Now, the problem I have with the prosecution's approach here is they're trying to use that control that Cassie delegated, at least a part of, voluntarily, to try to suggest that it's evidence of domestic violence. Right, folks? There's a business component. Whether we like it or not, there's a business component to Cassie's relationship with Diddy. Right? By her own admission, they start off platonically. The relationship is a business relationship. She is an artist on Diddy's label. Right? So jurors need to be very mindful here. Right? If there's any testimony that Diddy controlled my finances, jurors need to ask themselves, well, isn't that what she hired Diddy to do? Right? Isn't there a contract between the two of them? Didn't this relationship start out as a business relationship? If no sex was involved, if they weren't personally involved, couldn't she sue Diddy for failing to properly shepherd her career and for failing to properly manage her finances? Isn't there part of their relationship in which she has consented to him managing her finances? So I have problems with parts of her testimony. Right? She talks about how she meets Diddy at 19. Their relationship lasted on and off for a decade. Folks, 10 years. 10 years is a long time. That is a long time. In California, where I'm located, understand, if you're married for 10 or more years, that's deemed a long-term marriage under Family Code Section 4336. Right, folks? These two had, in essence, a long-term marriage. Right? She describes it as her first real adult relationship. That's her quote. First real adult relationship. So understand, it was an adult relationship. Whether it's the first, whether it's the last, it was an adult relationship. In other words, these two were physically involved. She uses the word relationship. Right, folks? This is a consensual relationship that lasted a decade. Right? Now, she testified that Combs exerted extensive control over her life and music career, including her appearance, finances, and personal belongings. Right, folks? Isn't that what music managers do? Isn't that what labels do? Right? You know, isn't a music manager someone who is going to tell you, hey, you should have this look? Right? Haven't we heard before artists complain that their music label, right, in cases not involving sex, ask them to lose some weight? Right? Again, isn't the reason you hire a music manager to negotiate deals on your behalf? Right? Doesn't the label have a vested interest if it's purely commercial? If there was no romantic relationship between these two, wouldn't the label have the right to step in, particularly if they've given you financial advances, which happens in the music industry? Right? Doesn't the label have a valid business reason to step in and say, hey, you're spending too much money. Your finances are upside down. Right? We're a creditor of you. Also, since you're an artist representing our label, we, in addition to being a creditor, have an investment in you as an asset. It would reflect negatively on the label if you were to go bankrupt. Right? Do you believe, outside of this case, that it's improper for labels to actually be concerned about an artist's appearance, about an artist's finances? Right, folks? I believe it's expected that if I sign with some high-powered label in whatever genre we're in, right? Bad Boy was big in R&B and hip hop, right? If I am lucky enough to sign with the label, right? A label that has Notorious B.I.G., countless others, a label that's connected in the industry, right? Where people know people, your sound engineer might be impressed by your talent, might talk you up to other people in the industry, folks who have venues where artists perform, or even promoters of several artists who travel together to maximize the value of the ticket that fans are buying, right? Summerfest, whatever, and they name 5 artists and stuff like that. As you can imagine, being with the right label, getting access to that world is what a lot of artists want. Now here, I'm going to criticize the prosecution. What they've done is glossed over the commercial label-artist relationship that Cassie had with Bad Boy and Diddy. And they're merging it into they had a romance. So the things that a normal label and manager would do with regard to an artist, now we're going to cast suspicion on them. Now we're going to make them sound like things for which someone could be legally liable. So, oh my goodness, Diddy was concerned about Cassie's appearance. Right, folks? You don't think that Taylor Swift's label isn't concerned about her appearance? You don't think that every artist out there, doesn't have someone in their background offering advice on their weight, their wardrobe, their hair, their songs? Folks, that's the nature of the business. Here, they're trying to make it look like Diddy is a control freak. They're trying to tell you because these two had a relationship, romantic relationship, after they met as, music honcho and artist, that the things that Diddy does with other artists, I'm sure, as a music honcho, were somehow nefarious because he was having a romantic relationship with Cassie. Folks, that's a sale they have not made with me. Right? Okay, I saw the video. Okay, I understand there's domestic violence involved. Right? But, am I supposed to believe that Diddy exerted so much control over Cassie's life that she couldn't make consensual decisions to engage in sex acts that the two of them filmed, that she couldn't agree to the filming of what they were doing privately as a couple with people they hired. Right? Let me just say this too. Her testimony is interesting because she talks about hiring prostitutes from other states. Right now, folks, this is a off and on, so you know you're getting some spin. This is an off and on 10-year relationship. That's a way to somehow shorten the 10 years. Right? In other words, you meet someone, she's 19. The two of you are still kicking it. Granted, there are twists and turns in the road, but the two of you are still kicking it at 27. Right? When she's 27. Right? With years to go in the relationship, right? 10 years connotes 19 to 29, doesn't it? Now, if the two of you are in a lifestyle where you're hiring prostitutes and they're traveling for get-togethers that the two of you call freak-offs, at what point does it become non-consensual? If it was consensual early on, at what point are we supposed to believe, because intent is a big part of claims like this, that Diddy was supposed to have reached a conclusion that the freak-offs they had been doing for years were suddenly non-consensual? Right, folks? Isn't that the million-dollar question in this case? Right? Is there non-consensual activity taking place? And did the people in the room know it was non-consensual? Did Diddy, the person on trial, know it was non-consensual? Right, folks? I think the prosecution, and these are high-powered prosecutors, but I think the prosecution is deliberately glossing all that over. Deliberately. Right? As for the sex trafficking, the way this was reported in the press, you got the feeling that Diddy was forcing people into prostitution, right? Through blackmail or what have you. Right? Diddy was forcing people into prostitution, and that somehow they were involved in sex that they didn't want to have. Let's ask a loaded question here. Is there any evidence that Diddy and Cassie herself is admitting that she's the person who talked with some of the prostitutes and hiring them? Is there any evidence that either of them hired a prostitute who was not already a prostitute? Right? Is it sex trafficking if I hire a prostitute and they happen to live in another state? Right, folks? I'm assuming, being a music mogul, Diddy and Cassie are traveling all over the United States. I imagine they have some prostitutes, the male sex worker who testified early in this trial, right? Who the prosecution, let's be clear, wanted to shock the jury with. Right? He was a favorite, apparently. He got invited back. Now, is it sex trafficking if I'm a music mogul? My girlfriend and I like to invite other people into our bed, prostitutes into our bed. And we have a favorite, right? We meet up with him in New York. We're in LA and we would like to have his company. We call him up and say, hey, do you want to come out to LA to be with us? We'll pay you for your time. And the person says, sure, I'll come. Right? I don't believe sex trafficking exists where you're hiring a prostitute and you're the person, or your girlfriend is the person who they're supposed to have sex with. And the person's already a prostitute. So there's something called jury nullification, where jurors just intuitively know that's not what the statute was written for, right? A New York prostitute traveling to Los Angeles to get together again with a couple he's already been with, where everyone's on the same page. Understand the relationship the male sex worker who testified had with the couple. He was sending texts directly to Cassie, right? He's with Cassie. His assumption is it's all consensual, right? Cassie's with Diddy not for 10 minutes, not for 10 days. She's with him, by her own admission, off and on for 10 years. Their custom and practice is to have these freak-offs, private freak-offs. So parts of her testimony where she talks about the fact that the freak-offs were drug-fueled and lasted 1.5 to 4 days. Right, folks? Some people like to party. Is that news in 2025 America? Right? Isn't the real question here whether she's a willing participant? Right? Let's just say if I'm a juror, I would view the presentation so far with suspicion. Right? I know Cassie talks about how Combs would, here's her quote, bash my head, knock me over, drag me, kick me, stomp me in the head if I was down. Right, folks? That's domestic violence. Right? Aren't you concerned? Aren't you very concerned as to whether the prosecution is trying to link domestic violence, for which Diddy is culpable, with crimes that shouldn't even have been charged? Sex trafficking? Really, when I'm hiring people who are already prostitutes to come have sex with me and my girlfriend? Really? Let me also say, too, the off and on for the 10 years. Not only is that designed to make it look like the 10 years was 10 days, but let's go further. Doesn't that defeat the prosecution's claim? So you mean to tell me during the 10-year period, you left him, right? The two of you were, your words, off and on. So you left him and then came back to him. Right now, I know there are many people watching this video who are thinking, you know what, I had odd relationships and I went back. But don't we also realize that it's impossible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that her going back was involuntary? Right? I mean, don't we kind of understand too that the idea that she's having sex against her will because Diddy controlled every aspect of her life, including her finances, even though she signed up voluntarily with his label and they had a business relationship where he was her business manager, right, a business label owner. Doesn't the fact that she left the relationship and then came back off and on for 10 years kind of connote that there were parts of the relationship that she was a willing participant in? right? So this far into the case, I'll just be blunt here. This looks like an overcharged domestic violence case, right? Yes, people do go back to abusive spouses. I don't question that for a second, right? Yes, you think it's going to be different this time. Promises are made. You go back to that spouse. But isn't that different here than freak offs? Right? If she's a willing participant in the freak offs, right? At what point does she stop being a willing participant? If the answer to that question is nebulous, then the freak off angle that they're linking to the domestic violence case is nebulous. Right? Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. I think, the fact that Cassie now looks back and says that she felt humiliated and objectified, right, is akin to, someone who's been involved in porn, whether public or private, who then looks back with regrets. I don't believe that's legally actionable unless she can make the claim that she didn't give her consent. Right? If she consented to the sex, no matter how freaky it was, right? If she consented to the sex, there's no legal claim there. Right? And the fact that Diddy, controlled parts of her life, right, doesn't negate the fact that she authorized him to control parts of her life, right? Didn't she sign a contract with his label? Right? That needs to be explored. She authorized him to control parts of her life. That's even before the two of them started a romantic relationship, a sexual relationship. Right? So I don't like where this is going. I'm curious to see the other witnesses who they have. Right? Cassie's testimony was effective in confirming the videotape and the fact that, she was hit on other occasions. For that, Diddy's responsible. Right? Now, let's just say the prosecution hasn't made its case with me that Cassie's participation over a 10-year period of time in freak-offs, some of them filmed, was non-consensual, that she was devoid of the ability to say no. Right? Understand, too, when you hear off and on, that means the guy's allowing her to leave. Right? Let me say this, too, and this is a troubling part of the case. She's claiming that Sean Combs threatened her career. Right? The inference is, and I believe it's too big of a leap, if you don't participate in these freak-offs, then I'm going to ruin your career. Right? That's the inference. Well, let me just say, it's just a fact of life in the music industry, as you know, that labels can drop artists. Right? That's just a fact of life. Right? So, I'm curious. To me, the link between her recording career and her participation in freak-offs hasn't been firmly established. Right? This looks to me like a couple that was living a swingers lifestyle, which necessarily means they were, partner swapping, what they call couple exchanging. Right? That's what it sounds like to me. And of course, the people they were having sex with, some of them were prostitutes. right? I don't get the feeling that Diddy is running some prostitution ring, right? Which is what I think of when I think of sex trafficking, right? I don't get the feeling that Cassie was there over a 10-year period of time against her will. Right now, she did, and this is testimony to consider, say that the hotel video shows her trying to leave a freak off. Right? Just because you consent to one freak off doesn't mean you consent to every freak off. But let me just say, the prosecution has a very high burden to prove that someone who consented to several freak offs didn't consent to this particular one. Right? I'm curious to hear from the other people who were involved in that freak off. The testimony so far, to me, has not been conclusive. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.